July 20th, 1969, a day that changed humanity and America forever. What do you know about that day? It's the day that humans landed on the moon for the very first time. We saw pictures and videos across the country of a few men walking around the moon, taking samples, being joyous. But how much do you really know about this day? Do you think that it's possible that what could have happened could have been faked? Is it possible that the events that happened didn't actually happen on the moon? I want to take you guys through the day of July 20th, 1969, and just kind of the history of America versus the USSR and some of the space race that was going on at the time, and just maybe get you thinking a little bit differently about what happened on July 20th, 1969. So to start, in order for the US to want to fake this moon landing, they had to have wanted to do it. There's no reason to do it if they didn't want to do it. And the reason and the motivation that they had for doing it was from the USSR. They were in the heat of the space race, which was going on prime in the Cold War. So there were two key events that led up to the moon landing, which the US lost to the USSR in the space race. The first one was that the Russians or the Soviets were able to get a satellite in space before the Americans were. The Russians launched Sputnik in 1957 and orbited the Earth for 21 days, and then about 3 years later, a year later, the U.S. launched its first satellite, and it was just a sad loss that they had. After that, the Soviets were then able to be the first people to put a man into space, and he orbited the Earth one time in 1961. His name was Yuri Gagarin, and he was known for being the very first man to ever be in space. The U.S. had Alan Shepard in Freedom 7. He was the first American to orbit the world, but that was, again, a couple years after the USSR. Excuse me, it was about a month afterwards. So that was a barely loss that they had. And twice there, the U.S. was losing to the USSR, and they were starting to look worse in the national media and the international media as well. So they're kind of saying that they have to do something about this. They wanted to do it, and in 1961, JFK, after he became president, said that by the end of this decade, we're going to get to the moon. And the current president at the time, Richard Nixon, was very adamant about doing this, and he really wanted to get the U.S. to the moon by the end of the 1960s, which 1969, you could say it was good timing that they finally figured it out, or maybe just they had to get it done by 1970. So in order to really understand what happened in the moon landing, I think you have to go and look at some of the videos and pictures from that day. So the whole story was that they had like a good 5 seconds worth of gas left before they were finally able to land. It was this dramatic scene where they see all these men, they were struggling and trying to figure out how they could get this thing landed without just being gone forever. And with the, like I said, 5 seconds to spare, they were finally able to land their ship. After they landed, we can start looking at a couple of pictures. I wish I could show you the pictures, but I don't have a PowerPoint to go along with this. But the first is pictures of double light. There's one photo of an astronaut climbing up into the spacecraft, and you see the light from the sun coming away, and then you see light coming from a different place. NASA said that it's reflection from the moon, but it kind of looks like a little bit of artificial lighting at this point. You shouldn't be able to see this astronaut because he's on the opposite side of the sun, but still this picture was taken, and you could clearly see this man. A sec is there's a picture of an astronaut with the space behind him, and you can see in his mask kind of what's going on in front of him as well. And in this picture, you don't really see any stars at all. There's no stars at all on the moon landing. You don't see them anywhere. NASA claims this is because of the reflection, and there's no atmosphere, that light reflects off the moon and it blinds the stars. I mean, that could be scientifically true. There's a lot of evidence that supports that. But kind of what we're looking at more is in the reflection, you might be able to see what looks like could possibly be a stagehand or someone that shouldn't be there in the reflection of the visor. So we're just not totally sure what we're seeing in the visor, and we're not totally sure like what's going on around him there. Next, there's a picture of a sea rock. I don't know if you've ever seen this picture before, but it's a rock that's lying on the moon, and there's just a big old sea on it, like in marker. You could see it clear as day. And a lot of people think that this was from a movie set, and this was not a real thing. And there's multiple pictures of this sea rock, but it was very, very small in the big picture. But if you zoom in, you can clearly see that there's a sea written on one of the rocks. And then something that's also discussed a lot is about the shapes of people's shadows. Everyone's shadow should be the same exact length because they're the same far from the sun. But in a lot of photos, you'll see that they have different shadow lengths. So could this be due to multiple light sources? Is there more than the sun in this space? Again, it's for you to decide. It's for you to understand. And then lastly, there's two photos that I was able to find online of mysterious cables or wires above astronauts, making them maybe seemingly float. It's just a strange thing to see when you see someone in space to have a very, very thin, almost invisible wire that you can kind of see just a little bit in the reflection of light. And it's like, why is this here? Should this be here? It's just something I think to raise some questions. It's maybe you should look at it yourself, the video all the way through, and try to dissect for yourself what you really see is going on here. Um, and to kind of wrap up, I want to talk about Stanley Kubrick. He was a man who made uh, American Odyssey 2001, I believe, or it's something along those lines, and it was a space film that came out in 1968. And a lot of people think that they used a lot of the same things on the set that they did in the actual moon landing. And they even go as far as to say that Kubrick himself directed the moon landing. In an interview where the tape was lost and we only have a transcript, he did come out and say, I faked the moon landing, but this is very shoddy information. I'm not totally sure if he said this. But the fact this information is out here is just something to consider, and also proves the fact that at the time humans were capable of creating a space-like scene. So it's the idea that because it can exist, it can exist. So it's just something that you can't really keep out of your mind. You can't not have it there. And just to conclude, I just want to go back to the point that the U.S. had the motivation, the technology, the people, the resources, and the means to do this. It doesn't necessarily mean that it happened, but I just want you to think a little bit more about what that day was, what the situation was, and just maybe consider the fact that it's possible the U.S. could have faked the moon landing.